All right, I think we're good to go. Well, with this session, I'd like to cover some really cool, awesome, some funky, some beautiful cacti and succulents that we can use in our desert landscapes. And there are so many. You have a list of the plants that we'll touch on. First, I want to just cover a few things. And to start with, what's a succulent? A succulent is a plant, since I can't see you all, have anybody answer. A succulent is a plant that has the ability to store moisture within its tissues. So when we get a good rain or we provide irrigation, these plants are able to intake this water and store this moisture within their systems to use as a reserve for later down the line in case there is an extended period of insufficient water. So we have different types of succulents. Some of these plants are considered leaf succulents. They store the moisture in their leaf tissues. Stem succulents, storing that water in their stems. And there aren't too many, but there are some root succulents, which primarily store this, a reserve of moisture within their root systems. So we're going to look at these. Here we have an example with our aloe plants. That's a pretty easy concept to visualize, that these big leaves are storing moisture within their tissues. Some other types of plants, many of us will use ice plants, perhaps as ground covers in our landscapes. Even though these leaves are smaller, they too are storing moisture in their tissue for down the line in case there's not enough water. Our prickly pear is an example of a stem succulent. Saguaros, of course, are stem succulents, and that's pretty easy to, equate stem succulent, saguaro, that big columnar stem. Well, with our prickly pears, these, what we refer to usually as the pads, they are, modified stem segments. So they're kind of flattened and, pancake-like, rounded or almost round in form. But those are stem segments. So we classify our prickly pears as stem succulents. This is a great example of a root succulent. Our just, I think, stupendous Arizona Queen of the Night cactus. It will, as it grows and matures, develop this increasingly enlarging tuberous root system. This would be soil level right here. And above ground, most of the year, it looks like almost like a dead stick. But below ground, this tuber is getting larger and larger as this plant ages. This root system is able to store quite a bit of moisture underground as a reserve. And we can also classify this as a stem succulent as well. These stems do have the fleshy tissue, and they are storing some moisture, but not nearly as much as that tuberous root system underground. Okay, so we kind of covered what's a cactus. It can store moisture in its tissues. Succulents. They can store moisture in their tissues. So cacti are succulents. Not all succulents are cacti, but all cacti are succulents. It's one of those situations. We can distinguish a cactus, which could be a stem, a leaf, or a root succulent of types. They're distinguished by a growth point, which we call the aerial. And from this growth point, we'll have leaves or spines or flowers or new stem segment develop from this growth point. So that's referred to as the aerial. None of our other types of plants, other types of succulents, have aerials. This is a prickly pear, and so this structure here this would be considered the aerial. And we see spines developing from this aerial on this prickly pear. We don't really see spines, but if we look closely, we'll see some bristle-like structures referred to as glochids. And those two are developing from that aerial tissue. Now, all these prickly pears, when a new pad develops, they actually have leaves. Fleshy, kind of conical in form, these are leaves. Mostly our cacti have very reduced or no leaves at all, but some of them will develop leaves. There are a few cacti that develop leaves that are kind of comparatively large in surface area and remain on a stem for extended periods of time. With our prickly pears, a newly developing pad will have these leaves on them, and soon after that pad kind of enlarges, develops, they will just wither and drop off. So they're not present for very long. Once a pad, an older pad, is developed, it's gone through that growth phase, that pad will never develop leaves again. It's only this new tissue, these newly developing pads. Oftentimes we use the spination, the kind of form and configuration, the number of the spines and so forth, to help classify our different cactus species. And you can see there is a wide range of spines, and some of our cacti, I pointed out those prickly pears that just had the glochids. This cactus doesn't have glochids or spines. So there are some that are quite people friendly, not able to harm us in any pokey way. Okay, so why should we use or consider using succulents and cacti in our desert landscapes? First off, they're generally very drought tolerant. There are some tropical species of cacti, and you might see these, a lot of them are epiphytes. Those are plants that tend to grow in relation to trees in a tropical area. And some of us might even use some of these as hanging plants, hanging planters. But overall in our landscape, I'd say all of those cacti that we're using are going to be quite drought tolerant. They would need very infrequent watering. I'd say they're about as low maintenance as you can get. You don't have a lot of leaf litter and whatnot that needs to be thought about, dealt with on a regular basis. And so often they can serve as just fabulous accent plants within our landscapes that can really draw your attention to a focal point, and they can just be fun. Here you see a range. Oh, the form and the texture of these plants is, I think, amazing. I grew up in the Midwest in Michigan, and I think there were one or two yucca species that were hardy enough, cold hardy enough to use in our landscapes. And I know of one cactus, one prickly pear species that is quite cold tolerant, but overall, we didn't have these magnificent sculptural forms to integrate in our landscape. So I think to really utilize these can be a very fun design element in our landscape. Let's take a minute to look at some of the needs of these succulent, these water storing plants in general. For the most part, they need well-draining soil. We don't want to place them in heavy clay soil or really compacted soil situations that won't drain well, because this could cause problems with rot developing from the root system and traveling up through the cactus. So we want a soil that will drain that water when it's available, will drain it off relatively quickly. As far as sun exposure, well, Not all cacti want to be out in blaring sun all day. So as with all of our other landscape plants, this is going to require a little bit of studying, a little bit of investigation to find out these needs of the succulents that you're interested in. And I'll probably use the term succulent loosely to include cacti through the presentation. But for our succulents, some of them would like a little bit of relief from the sun, especially midday or afternoon in the summer. Others just will not tolerate direct sun at any time of the year. It's important to know that exposure need of the succulents you're working with. Looking at temperatures, well, in some areas of the valley, we can get pretty cold. We have had in the last decade or couple decades some pretty major freeze events. So I think it's important to look at how cold hardy these plants are in terms of them being safe when we do have a hard freeze, or perhaps safe in with just your typical winter night temperatures in your landscape. We have to think about nighttime temperatures during the summer months, and I'll touch on this again in a minute, with water, overall infrequent watering with our succulent plants, and most of them need very little fertilizer at all. Considering sun exposure, if you were a prickly pear here, you would not be getting much relief from the sun at any time of the day. So when we have this all-day sun exposure, we need to select wisely. As I mentioned, some of these plants, even some of the cacti, will not be happy with an exposure such as this. So we need to investigate, and I call this Cacti's shade scale. When I think about a Palo Verde, to me that produces light shade. You have some light filtering through the canopy of the tree, but you get that dappled sunlight coming through. So it's not by any means a dense shade. And you'll have a little bit of the sun pattern traveling, through the day. So our plants will be getting a little bit, slight bits of direct sun as the sun moves through the sky during the day. I would consider a mesquite to offer moderate shade. Their canopy tends to be a little bit denser than a Palo Verde, but it's not super dense. And we can still grow, quite a range of things under a mesquite canopy. A wide selection of plants would be happy with the light shade of a Palo Verde. When we start thinking about a ficus tree, or one of my favorites, the Texas ebony, they produce dense shade. To have something in that shade condition all through the day, it's going to be very, very difficult. Even our more shade-loving succulents might not thrive. They could survive, but might not thrive and be robust and perhaps offer a good flowering in a deep shade. So take a look at the sun exposure, the shade in areas of your landscape, and think about it, how it changes through the year also. That will be important. It's not, a set sun shade situation as we cycle through the year. If you do need some shade, you can perhaps depend on some kind of structure. This is actually, we see the shadow of a mature columnar cactus, offering a little bit of shade to these smaller cacti here, which are really appreciating it. These aren't in full shade, at any time of the day, but these plants, as the shade of this columnar form as the sun passes through the sky during the day, you get sun, shade, and that's a good protection for these plants. Or maybe a wall or something will throw a shadow. If that's not available, you can go to artificial means, shade cloth. This can be purchased at garden centers, but be careful. Some of the big box stores just provide 85% shade, perfect for pets and people. not good for our plants. We don't want to swing from too much sun to not enough light reaching our plants. Overall, we recommend that you get shade cloth that's rated from 30 to 50 or 60% reduction in the sun coming through. And that is perfect for most of our plants. So you can get small packages perhaps of shade cloth, or a good garden center will have, a big bolt of it, and you can pull it off and, buy however many yards or feet that you want of that product. Mostly for our plants, shade cloth is available in black, green, or kind of a cream color. All those designer colors, those are going to be that heavier shade for people and pets. But it's best to support this above your plant. If it's a desperate situation, you've got to immediately provide some shade, some relief, and you don't have a structure to use, the next best thing is to just drape it right over the plant. But that doesn't give you good air circulation around the plant, so it's best to support it above the plant. You got good air movement and that shade offered to your plants. That's the most ideal. Out in nature, some of our plants, such as our mighty saguaro, generally start out with what we call a nurse plant. It could be something just a little triangle leaf burr sage. Those usually aren't more than about a foot in height by the time they mature, or a creosote bush. Sometimes it might even be a native little leaf palo verde or blue. But these plants offer protection. That protection will hold moisture, a little bit more moisture for an extended period of time in the soil, but also protects these plants from predators. Even a spiky little baby saguaro is a tasty morsel to a lot of herbivores. So it kind of shields them from a lot of intense direct sun, keeps the soil more moist, and keeps them hidden from something that might eat them when they're at a very young age. So this is kind of a concept, even a saguaro benefits from a little bit of shade until it gets to even about a foot in height. That's when it can really be, sturdy and robust in direct sun all day. Looking at some different succulents, this is an aloe leaf, an agave or prickly pear. What happens when these plants are receiving too much of a good thing, too much direct sun exposure, they will start to sunburn, just like we do. So, we initially get pink. If we disregard that, we start getting red and, real sunburn sets in. If we're paying attention, initially our succulents will kind of change from their typical green color to a yellowing color. If we act then, if we start to turn pink and put the sunscreen on or our big hat or go indoors, we can reverse that and there's no permanent damage. If we disregard this yellowing coloration, that tissue will turn white. That indicates sunburn. Eventually this might turn tan or even brown. This is going to be dead tissue. For humans, you'll peel and have fresh skin come forth from underneath that. With our succulents, for the most part, most of these, that's going to be there. Maybe it's just cosmetic damage, but that will be there on that plant for perhaps years because they don't just drop off all these leaves on an annual basis. Here is a prickly pear. It just so happened, initially these pads were vertical and then they were moved so they were almost horizontal, and that's when they burned. So this is basically calloused dead tissue there, and that will never be green again. So we need to pay attention to the signs that our plants are telling us, they're trying to tell us, hey, I need shade. What happens if you use that 85% shade cloth? Probably you'll get etiolation, or a former curative cactus a friend at the Desert Botanical Garden would refer to these as pointy heads. You can see with this Mexican fence post, these stems should continue straight up being nice and thick. With a severe reduction in light, the growth has gotten narrower and narrower until they've developed these pointy heads. These cacti too, they're getting skinny. So this is irreversible. So we don't want to overdo it. And if you're playing Trivial Pursuit, the cactus and succulent Trivial Pursuit game, you can wow your friends with this word etiolation, meaning not getting sufficient light for proper growth. Another thing to think about with the light exposure, some of our plants will just like come alive and give us a whole new dimension as far as their appearance when they are backlit by the sun. So many cacti are just, they'll glisten and glow with the sun behind them. And we might have things like yuccas or agaves with leaf margins that are yellow or red that will just like pop out in the landscape when they're backlit by the sun. When you're working with plants like this, think about, ooh, how do I strategically place these in the landscape where they will really show off their true beauty, full beauty, when that sun is low in the sky, morning or afternoon. With our temperatures, there are succulents that can be damaged by cold temperatures during the winter, particularly if they're not from our region, maybe from Mexico or South America, or here, this elephant food is from Africa. They are native to regions where they just don't typically face the cold temperatures that we do at night during the winter months. Something like this, well, there's still good, healthy tissue below this. This is a case where, you might trim off these bad stems at the end of the winter. With an aloe or an agave, that is permanent damage on those leaves. They have, from the tip, they've burned back, dried up, and that's going to be permanent damage on that plant. So know how cold of a temperature they can sustain, and you select wisely. And if it's something that it's colder than usual, you might need to protect that plant with some frost cloth. This is material that's very light in weight. It will allow about 70% of the sun to pass through. So if it's a situation where you have maybe 3 or 4 nights in a row where it's supposed to be below freezing, you might want to cover your plants. You could leave them covered with this material because it will allow sufficient light to filter through that will allow the plants to at least do a little photosynthesizing to keep robust. But the concept with covering your plants is that you cover full to the ground. If it's best if we can do this mid or late afternoon before a cold night, trap as much warm air as you can in around your plant, make it just this nice tent. Also, any heat radiating from the soil surface below will be trapped in there. You don't want to bunch it up and tie it to the stem of a plant. You'll be losing that radiating heat that you could take advantage of overnight. But you do want to make sure that it's secure with rocks or landscape pins so that it won't flap off if we do have wind. Advantage of this is that you can leave it on for a few days or even a week. If you're using sheets, old bed sheets, and especially if you're using burlap, you really should remove those the next morning about 9 o'clock or so after danger of frost has passed in the morning, and then recover if necessary the next afternoon. To me, this is easier using this material. Can leave it on for even up to a week. For our columnar cacti, or maybe the growing tip of an agave or an aloe bloom that's about to shoot up, use styrofoam cups. Insulation. It's good insulation to protect those tips. With a situation like this, the most vulnerable is the growing tip on each one of these stems. So on the agave, it's about to send up its bloom stalk here, and covering that will protect it because those bloom stalks are usually not as cold hardy as the plant itself is overall. So you can pop these on. Try not to leave these on for too long, and especially they have to be removed before any growth restarts with the spring temperatures. So, you know, hopefully styrofoam's going away, you know, especially for things like cups. But if you're out and about and you have a beverage served in a styrofoam cup, kind of wipe it out, you know, clean it, take it home and store it in case you need to protect the growing tip, the meristem of a cactus. Okay, nighttime temperatures. During the summer, we've all seen these, you know, last few years especially, we will have stretches where perhaps the temperature doesn't go below 95 at night. And if this occurs on, you know, a few nights in succession, it can greatly impact some of our succulent plants. Some of our succulent plants are actually opening their pores and taking in carbon dioxide at night, as opposed to most of our leafy plants do that during the day. And if the night is so hot, those stomates, the pores won't open, and they're not then able to carry out photosynthesis, and they just kind of collapse. At first, it might look like, oh, maybe this plant rotted from overwatering or something, but this failed because it was just faced with too many hot nights. So there are groups of our succulent plants, especially things related to jade plants. We call them crassulas, or things that are related to those aeoniums, another beautiful leafy succulent. They really get hit hard. So, you know, you might even end up considering these cool season annuals if you'd really like to have them. Or if you do keep them in a container, it might be easier to move them to a cooler location perhaps when we have these hot nights predicted. Watering. Most of our succulents need infrequent watering. So if you have an irrigation system and you have a valve, maybe you've got a little bit of turf and you have a valve for that, and you know, you might have a valve for your desert perennials, a valve for your desert shrubs, another one for your desert trees. What you can do is kind of figure out a compatible valve for your succulents. It might work really well for a lot of the agaves. They would be, you know, pretty good paired up with maybe your desert adapted shrub watering schedule. So you could piggyback them on that line, you know, that with that valve in your irrigation system. Perhaps for larger cacti, you could, you know, pair them with your desert tree valve system. And there are some, particularly have some of the cacti from South America or Central America that they really do originate in areas that get a little bit more rain than what we do here. And maybe the temperatures aren't quite as high during the summer. You might consider those cacti, adding them to your shrub line instead of the tree line, because they might need, you know, that irrigation maybe about every, you know, somewhere between every 7 and 14 days during our hottest, driest month, maybe June. So think about that. How can I match watering schedules the needs of my succulents to perhaps add them to a valve that already exists with your desert landscaping. Now, a lot of us, especially if you're like myself, you grew up in the Midwest or some other area, any other area in the country, we're usually pretty, attuned to when a shrub or, a tree, a perennial needs water. The leaves, you can just, tell with their beginning droopiness or something. But we might not really catch on to the signals that our succulents will give us. This is a beautiful cow's horn agave, and it just happened to go a little longer stretch than it should have without getting irrigation. The leaves changed their orientation so that they were more vertical. This would mean that they'd have less direct sun hitting them at the hottest part of the day, rather than when they were more relaxed and a little bit more angled. So this is a great signal of, hey, I need water. Once this agave got a nice soaking around its root system, it reverted back to that nice relaxed angle form of those beautiful leaves. So look for signals like that. Prickly pears, a well-hydrated prickly pear. We look at it sideways, it's going to have kind of a straight side. If it's lacking in water, it's gone through a good amount of its moisture reserves, it's going to be kind of emaciated, sunken in. Here, looking straight onto the pad, nice and plump, but when it's gone through moisture reserves, looking straight on, you might see that wrinkling appear. So these are things to look for to let us know that we really do need to give this succulent a good irrigation. We really need to be conscientious about moisture up near our structures, so we want to use nice succulents that need infrequent watering. Probably are the best choice for having near the wall, the side of our home, so that we're not having too much moisture accumulate there. When we're planting our succulents, especially agaves, cacti, things like this, we want to maintain the orientation that they've had as they were growing and developing before we were ready to plant them. The tissues will develop a little bit differently on the east side versus the west side, as an example. And so those tissues that were growing on the east side, if we suddenly move them to the west side or south side where they'd be getting more intense sun, the tissue will have a tendency to burn. And as I gave the examples before where that was permanent damage on those poor plants. We want to maintain the level from which these were growing in the soil. Now, in this landscape here, you can see where the soil line was in the container of this prickly pear. Well, it's okay that it's set a little high, because these folks are going to come in and put like a 2-inch thick layer of gravel around this plant. So it turns out that this is like the perfect level for putting this, planting it in the soil. Too often in the valley, when people plant big specimen saguaros, especially if they've got arms, that's a lot of weight, so that they won't just topple over. Some people who are not nice will bury them deeper than their original soil line to hold them upright. They should be braced, not buried deep. What will happen is, might be 5 years, probably even more like 10 years down the line, that stem section that was planted way too deep will eventually start to decay. And then eventually you get your saguaro doing this. So this one had been buried way too deep, and I had excavated, this was 8 inches. of soil I had excavated, still needed a lot more excavation to uncover the damage done. With our saguaros, we should see a tapering. It just seems to me counterintuitive. This big, huge thing is going to have a skinnier base than the rest of the plant, but that's how they grow. So if you are to have a saguaro planted in your property, make sure that you see that taper. If it's straight to the ground, that tells you they planted it too deep. All right, so with our saguaros, we want to see the taper. For our succulents, whenever possible, especially if they're smaller, 1 or even 5 gallon size, or box size even, if we can remove the soil from the roots a few days before we intend to plant and set these out of direct sun, put them in some nice filtered sunlight or light shade for a few days, let those thick fleshy roots callus. Any little breaks or tears that occur, let those heal over. When you then plant them in the landscape, you have the best situation where it's a homogeneous soil that these roots will grow and develop through. That is like the best. It'd be awesome if we could do that with every single one of the plants we put in our landscape. Oftentimes that soil that our plants are grown in the nursery, it's a mix a lot of times to just make these plants grow as fast and robust as possible. And it is very different from our desert soil. So I really do recommend shaking or removing or washing the soil from the root system of your cactus or other succulents, and then plant it just in our desert soil. It has a homogeneous soil system to develop into then. That is the perfect. You don't have to worry about differences in the soil moisture of that potting soil versus the native soil. You know, how to water, it's the best. Our young, newly planted succulents might be a target for herbivores. Even though they're cute, they can do a lot of damage. It may be necessary to use some maybe ugly chicken wire to protect these plants, but you will want to protect them because this damage, that's permanent. Sometimes, depending on what it is, once they get some, you know, good growth to them, they might not be as tasty, but you might need to protect them initially. Now, I want to razzle dazzle you with some just a few selections of these wonderful plants. You have a list on your handout, and I've included the botanical name. This is always best to shop with. There have been some changes with genetic studies and whatnot. So if that's the case, I've put the older name in parentheses, but either way, the currently accepted or previously accepted name, they're universal. You can run into all kinds of complications with common names when you're shopping for plants. So that's why I've given you that botanical name. And I'm going to run through these. There are some plants on the list that I'm just going to skip over, but I thought they were cool, so I still wanted to have them on the list. So those that have the little dash before the name, they're indented a bit, those we will skip over. And you can investigate those later. But I'm going to start with some kind of nice, smaller columnar cactus, such as our different hedgehogs. There are different species. This one has this beautiful magenta bloom in the spring. There are other species that might have red or orange flowers in the spring, but these are just fabulous. After pollination, they'll develop these grapefruits. But these are nice. They can grow in full sun to very light shade. And they're just a nice size that we can tuck in here and there in our landscape. Now this is a low growing columnar that gets quite a bit larger. Some of these stems, individual stems, might even eventually get to be 3 or 4 feet in length and about, maybe 6 or 8 inches in diameter. Night blooming with these spectacular, gorgeous flowers during summer months. These can take full sun here in the valley or light shade, but these can get quite large as they age. Now for shade. These are little cacti that are from South America. And all of these recommend that they be put in filtered sunlight all day or morning sun and afternoon shade, but not midday, afternoon, or all day sun exposure during the summer. There are a range of these. There are some species, but most of them are hybrids, and they range in their flowers from just delicate pastels, pinks, and kind of sorbet colors to really some spectacular hybrids of wild and crazy colors. So these generally are going to be night bloomers. Usually each flower is only open for one night. These can just be kind of small-sized treasures tucked into your landscape in a lightly shaded area. This is a cool one, pinecone cactus. Now there are some variations on this. This one has almost a smooth stem. You can see how it gets the name. Young new stems developing look like pine cones. But this one, it's kind of smooth. It does have glochids, but they're actually inverted at that aerial point, inverted into the stem. These are great. They can grow in full sun or light shade. There are some relatives. Some have wide kind of papery spines. Others have narrow spines that kind of spiral. They all get these beautiful white flowers with this kind of cream and green center during the summer. Some of our rounded forms, barrel cacti. From Mexico, we have, of course, the wonderful golden barrel. My recommendation, since it seems like we're just getting more extreme in our summers, I really do recommend that you don't put any new ones, newly planted barrel cacti, out in full sun. I've seen too many the last years or so that they're put out in full sun and they just burn. That would be a shame. So maybe, a little morning sun to maybe a little bit of midday or afternoon shade, I think would be ideal for the golden barrel. We do have native barrel cacti that are still great to put out in full sun. This is one of them, the compass barrel. It will start out rounded, globular in form, and elongate as it matures. And these can get 4, 5, 6 feet in height even. They have lovely flowers starting early summer on through the summer, and then produce fruits that remain for quite a while. Now, this is a good use of color. You can pick and choose some of these cacti with colorful spines. You have this color year round in your landscape. And then that's complemented during blooming season with the flowers. This backlit, one of the common names is fire barrel. And, backlit by the sun. These spines just glow and they look like you've got flames. So have fun with plants like this. Prickly pears. This is our smaller scale prickly pear native to our region. I would say though that this is among the most finicky regarding drainage. The beaver tail prickly pear has to have a really well draining soil. Otherwise, from the base up, it will just rot. So not a good thing. Make sure you have nice, well draining soil for this. In the spring, to complement that bluish green coloration of the pads, you get this magenta, brilliant flowers there that oftentimes you'll have numerous flowers on one plant. More of an upright tree form would be the Indian fig prickly pear. It has lovely kind of golden orange flowers, followed by fairly rounded fruits, and there usually aren't spines. They might have the small bristly glockets, however. It just depends on individual plants that you're working with. But these can be a nice tree form in a landscape. I think this is so cool because of these really long spines. They can be 3 or even 4 inches in length. They are, I think, just wild and funky. They're generally found only on the top half of a pad. Perhaps more attractive to most people would be this beautiful, beautiful bicolored flower. You have the scarlet red and then just brilliant yellow on the tips of these petals. So fun, fun, fun color on this prickly pear. And then year round, you have that little bit of a purplish color there. And here you can see some more of these. Can you tell I really like these? And then a little bit more purple color you would find with the purple prickly pear. Most of the year you have a little bit of a purple tinge, perhaps on the margin of the pads, which are kind of a bluish color, bluish green. When these are stressed, so during the winter with cool temperatures, or perhaps really hot temperatures in the summer, you get more pronounced color. The pigments in those pads stands out more in those extreme conditions. In late spring, usually you have these lovely yellow flowers. It just tops off all that purple and blue of these plants. Now, choyas, related to our prickly pears, but more cylindrical form of a stem. The teddy bear choya, no, it's not huggable, but when we have these spines backlit by the sun, they just glow. Oops, sorry about that. These can range, sometimes they're mainly just one stem towards the base and then branch higher up. Other times they will branch quite a bit right from the base all the way up. Very delicate looking flower for such a spiky beast. And looking at our columnar cacti, of course, our saguaro. Around April, we have these magnificent flowers that open at night. You'll have a range of pollinators visiting these. Might be bats, depending on the location, but in the morning, you'll have bees and hummingbirds and mourning doves and all kinds of winged creatures visiting these flowers. Around late June or early July, we will have fruits ripen, and they are very delicious if you ever get a chance to taste some. But just remember, you want to make sure that you locate your saguaro in a good spot where it's not going to get overwatered from turf or anything like that, and make sure that the base of it tapers when it's planted. And when birds build nests, I'd say 99% of the time, there's no problem. It's rare that a bacterial infection actually is associated with the building of those nests. It's just a natural association. So let the birds build their nest and just enjoy that cycle of life that's associated with those nest holes. Here from South America, we have the Peruvian apple cactus. An example, I would say, this would certainly benefit from more frequent watering than we would provide for our saguaro. Might be a mature saguaro, you might be watering once a month if we don't get a good rain. For your Peruvian apple cactus, I would say at least every 3 weeks or maybe every 2 weeks at the hottest, driest periods of the summer months. But they will not fare well if we try to approach their watering like we would with our our saguaro or something. We'll see an organ pipe in a minute. They are much more drought tolerant. But you get fabulous blooms at night during the summer, and there are some what we call monstrous forms of these available also. If you want vertical and don't want to, maybe it's a narrow space and you don't want to worry about branches developing on some of these other cacti, the Mexican fence post is about as upright as you can get. They are just beautiful forms, very sculptural. Some of them have pinkish to reddish flowers, others more of a cream to green color. So same plant, just different flower colors. And these, you'll have the hummingbirds visit those flowers. If you need a friendly cactus, totem pole generally has no spines. It's very rare that you find one on these, but they're just the cool lumpy stemmed form of a native cactus that you might know as the Sanita. So there are friendly cacti that we can include in our gardens. Here we have the organ pipe. So you want to make sure if you're in a really super cold area, I wouldn't suggest this, but for most of the valley, we're pretty safe with our winter nighttime temperatures for growing the organ pipe. And they too have lovely flowers, followed by kind of a golf-sized fruit that's just yummy. I've heard that's one that I haven't had a chance to taste yet. But these will get massive when they are maturing. So this is decades of growth that we see here. Some succulents, agaves. Here's another word for your trivial pursuit to blow the minds of your friends, monocarpic. That is the term that kind of is associated with our agave plants. It refers to their life cycle. They will grow to maturity, bloom once, and that's it. They die. So agaves, some mature to just 6 or 8 inches in height and spread. Others mature to 6 or 7 feet in height and spread. Really important to know your agave before you choose one to include in your landscape. The squid agave is pretty small overall, just a lovely form. It is friendly. It doesn't have nasty terminal spines on the leaves or nasty tips to rip you and shred you. And I think they're just adorable little forms. And so many of these plants, we can use them in big size containers as well as planting them in the ground. Another friendly one is the smooth-leafed agave. This is available in all green form. Most often this is what we find. There is also a variegated form that has this pale yellow margin on both sides of the leaves. And they will send up, our agaves, they send up spectacular blooms, stems. If only we could all go out with such a, grand hurrah, last hurrah. They are, once they've bloomed, they are going to die. Now, some agaves will form what we call pups, and others are solitary. Something like our twin-flowered agave, it just remains one plant throughout its life. Once it matures, it will send up a bloom stalk in a spike form, straight with all the flowers coming right off of the stem. The agave desmediana, the smooth leaf that I just showed you, that's what we call a candelabra flower inflorescence or bloom form. It branches. So some are solitary, like that twin-leafed agave. Others will form pups. These are genetic clones of the parent plant. Once this original plant matures and blooms and dies, the pups that develop later, they will remain, and then they'll go through the same cycle themselves. They'll mature and die. But look at this. These are wicked terminal spines on this agave. But look at that magnificent color. You have that silver green of the leaf, and then this deep, deep kind of black maroon terminal spine there, very dramatic. Here's another one that is remains an individual, a solitary head on this agave with another spike. So this one is a medium-sized agave. That bloom stalk usually gets to be about 10 to 12 feet in height. Some of these larger species might even get bloom stalks that are 25 feet tall. Lovely, very, very sculptural form with this artichoke agave. And the terminal spines on this all have a little wiggle to them. They're, instead of being straight, they've got a little curve to them. Queen Victoria, these leaves are really stiff. They have lovely markings on the leaf. This is what we call a bud imprint. So where the leaves form next to each other, you know, real tight when they're still tender, it'll leave sometimes an imprint. And with this, it takes off some of the white margin of one leaf, sticks to that bud imprint on the other leaf, leaving a beautiful marking there. Another medium-sized agave. The octopus agave is yet another one of those friendly agaves. Just be aware, most of those friendly agaves, we can easily damage them. Oftentimes those leaves are, you know, they might seem supple, but they're actually kind of brittle and they can break easily. Some of these, they clone from what we call bulbils on the flower stem. And when we plant bulbils, all from one parent, they're going to grow and mature at the same time. You can get spectacular shows like this. But then, of course, they're all going to die at the same time also. But then save some pups, save some of those bulbils, and you can plant them and start the cycle all over again. Here is a hybrid called Blue Glow. And you can see the leaves have kind of a bluish green color. Why glow? That part of the name comes from when they are backlit. It looks like they've got lights, yellow and red lights on the margins of these leaves. So with agaves like this, to make them super special, locate them where you can admire that feature when the sun is low. Now there's so many aloes. With our aloes too, some of them are small. Some do remain solitary forms, others pup like crazy. You might have grown the aloe vera, the medicinal aloe, and some are tree form actually and get quite tall. So again, we have a wide variation. Most of them are cool season bloomers, but they're, you know, that within the cool season, that's kind of a staggered bloom between different types. So bright, colorful blooms on this Dawes aloe. And here's one of the tree aloes called quiver tree. It produces just one solitary stem, and when it branches, it always has two diversions, so dichotoma. And this one has been recently renamed. Sorry, I forgot to put that on your handout. Used to be aloe dichotoma, now it's Aleodendron. Same plant, just the taxonomists found something different. But the flowers, aren't those lovely? So every time it branches, it's going to fork into two parts. And we'll see this again in a minute. Smaller. This sunset aloe, most of the year has a little bit of a pinkish or red color, more pronounced in the winter with the cold temperatures. Here's another tree aloe. Most of these are slow to you know, start making that stem and develop that form. Spectacular, dramatic blooms on this Aloe ferox, the Cape aloe. And here, like the agaves, they have bud imprints on some of these too that offer lovely designs when we're up close and personal with our aloes. So here's our aloe vera. Pups like crazy. All of these are clones of one original plant there in that cluster. So this is when you, if you want to thin them, you can, leave them on the doorstep of everybody in your neighborhood. Blue elf, this is a nice small plant that clumps, but not, hugely. And it can grow in full sun or light to even moderate shade and have a nice bloom. They're pretty long blooming. You usually get a few months of bloom on your blue elf. I showed you that quiver tree. This Hercules is a hybrid. Two parents came together and made this, and one of the parents was this quiver tree. But these leaves are huge on this hybrid, hence the name Hercules. And it's much faster growing than its one parent, the quiver tree. A few of our wonderful ice plants. This one has a phenomenal bloom in the spring, and then you have this really cool foliage the rest of the year. I will warn you, for some areas of the valley, birds become enamored in these juicy succulent leaves. Other areas of the valley, they don't seem to bother them. Here's one though. This has, instead of one expansive bloom in the spring, most of the year you just have flowers dotting it here and there. So it's not, like brilliant with its bloom, but it's a steady source of kind of, muted color there. And also a relative with yellow blooms. So these are nice, low-growing, spreading plants that we can use. The Bulbini, it's kind of a grass-like leaf, but it's very thick and fleshy. Long bloom. Usually starts in October and continues right on through the spring. These in the valley, I do recommend they get a little bit of shade during the summer. There's also, in addition to the yellow blooming form, this orange blooming form. Now, euphorbias. Overall, euphorbias exude milky sap. They exude a milky sap from the stems or leaves when they are broken. You always want to be careful. Wear gloves, long sleeves, have eye protection when you're working with these to be safe. Some people, they might react very strongly to that milky sap. Other people, it doesn't really bother them. But I'd hate for anyone to find out that they have a bad reaction, the wrong way. But this is a great one for a real sunny area. They'll maintain stronger, more upright stems in more sun and have more profuse bloom. These flowers are tiny. They remind me of little kind of, cake decoration candies or something, but just lovely, nice sculptural form to the landscape. Here is a succulent. It seems kind of, odd that you would have such large leaves on a succulent plant. These can take full sun if they're getting watered about, once a week or so. In more shade, you could, stretch it out to every other week maybe with their watering. But they have these upright stems typically and the coolest, funkiest flowers. So it's actually a structure, the bract, it's a modified leaf that gives you most of that color. And here's the funky actual flower there. Hummingbirds will visit these flowers. You're probably more familiar with, you've probably seen here or there around the valley, its relative, the slipper plant, which has a cool funky flower that the hummingbirds visit. But these are great. They can grow in full sun or light or even moderate shade. With moderate shade, you probably have a reduction in bloom. Another euphorbia with real thick, beefy, chunky stems. And if they do bloom, which is not always here, but if they do, they have teeny tiny little yellow flowers on the stems. So if these need to be in full sun or almost, if they're in more shade, the stems get skinny and stretchy, and it just doesn't look nice. Some might be familiar with the pencil plant. This is one that just really oozes sap if you break a stem or cut a stem. So be careful, be cautious. I don't recommend these go in full sun unless maybe they're planted in the ground. And these can get quite large if they're planted in the ground. Over the years, they get quite large. Probably, I'd say very, you know, a real showstopper these days, a lot of people are using these, very popular now, is the fire stick. So this is just a variation of that pencil tree, pencil plant. Now they're like this. This is that reaction to the cold temperatures. You get this dramatic color during the winter, during the spring and fall, even the summer. It's more of just kind of a pale orange, greenish orange stem tips here. But during the winter, these are spectacular. If you like funky, like myself, these Manfredas have splotches on the leaves, which is, I think, very fun and interesting. They develop elongated bloom stems loaded with nectar to appease the hummingbirds. And there are different species available of these Manfredas. Elephant food, this is such, I'd say, about the most versatile succulent we can use in our gardens and our landscapes. It can grow in full sun to lighter, even it's one that you could put in that dense shade, but it's going to get pretty stretchy. But I'd say it might do better than a lot of other plants. And there are also variegated leaf forms of this elephant food that do need some shade during the summer. But I mean, we can use these in so many great ways. Ground cover, cascading out of a retaining wall or a big pot in our landscape. So for shade, the sansevierias, the snake plant, or some people call them mother-in-law's tongue. So many of us might have used these as houseplants. Outdoors, they have to be in the shade. Do not have them in direct sun even during the winter, I would say. But in a shady location, not the dense shade though, you won't get blooms, but light to moderate shade. These are so cool. There are so many different species and a lot of hybrids available these days. In general, the blooms that they send up are very sweetly scented. They'll vary from one type to another. Some of these are low growing, others have real thick, real wide stems. My favorite has a round stem, cylindrical stem, and its flowers smell like sweet coconut. And again, this is another great candidate for containers that you might use to embellish an entryway or to use in your landscape. And here's another flower form on one of these. So they're just, I think, very, very fun plants, great plants to use in those light to moderate shaded areas. And yuccas, there are low growing yuccas. A lot of them will, with age, form bunches. They'll develop additional stems as they age. The banana yucca develops fleshy fruits. Most of the yuccas develop what we call a dry capsule. This is fleshy and it's actually edible. All of our yuccas are going to have flowers with petals that are thick and kind of waxy. They range from cream color to kind of a greenish cream to maybe slight pink tinge on them. Majority of them bloom late spring or early summer. So we do have these low growing forms, and there are also tree-like forms. These are typically slower to develop, but they can be magnificent features in our landscapes. I love this soap tree yucca. The leaves are very narrow and have nice, like, kind of thread-like filament coming off of the margins. They develop a bloom stalk that extends above the top rosette of the foliage. So they can really be spectacular, reaching into the sky as they mature. And here's one of the lower growing It does clump, but not profusely. This pale leaf yucca, and this is one that, it's nice, it's slow growing, you can really enjoy the flowers close up. It does have a lovely yellow margin on the leaves that really lights up when it's backlit by the sun. And another tree-like form, this one, the that inflorescence, it'll rise a little bit above the top of that leaf rosette, but not quite as high as the soap tree yucca. It has, again, like that pale leaf yucca, pale yucca, it has that yellow leaf margin. And these leaves are narrower, longer, and they just have a nice form to them. Lovely, lovely. So I whizzed through a lot of plants. You can find quite a few of these in this booklet. Many of you might have this. It is available. You can get this hard copy from our city water conservation office. If you don't have one, I encourage you to enjoy this book online. It has added bonus of a search feature. You can enter your parameters here and it helps you narrow down a plant list of potentials to use in your landscape. The other thing is, with the printed version, we could only have one photo per plant. Of these 200 low water use plants featured online, we have sometimes numerous examples, numerous photos, so you can really get a better all-around picture of the plants that you might be investigating. I think this is a great tool to use when you're kind of researching plants to add to your landscape. And this is found on the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association website, which offers a whole lot of very useful information, not just for our landscapes, but our overall state water situation as well. So include some of these plants in your landscape. You don't have to go wild and crazy like this example, but I think this is fun. I would hate to be, have to get in there and pick up any trash that might have blown in a storm, but I think it's a fun example. As I say, not for all of us, but it's kind of cool to enjoy in passing by. And thank you so much for joining us. You can get additional information if you need it from either the city of Chandler or the town of Queen Creek. You can see their websites here, as well as contact emails and phone numbers. Do we have any questions, Daniela?
We actually don't. I don't see any in the chat, but go ahead if you do have a question you want to get answered before we sign off, go ahead and enter it into the chat. But so far, no questions. I just, again, want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and Cacti for a great presentation. I definitely learned a lot, so thank you.
I hope you got some useful information, just overall information about using these wonderful water storing plants in your landscape. And I hope some of the examples that I shared with you will inspire you to try some of them in your landscape. Thank you.
Thank you. And as Cacti mentioned, if you do have other questions, that pop up later after the class, you can contact us by the information on the screen. And then we do have a short survey when you exit the WebEx, and we would really appreciate it if you just took a minute of your time to fill that out. It lets us know how we're doing, what new classes we can offer in the future. So definitely take a minute to fill that out if you have a minute. But so far, no questions, Cacti.
Yeah, I encourage you to take a minute with the survey. These surveys, whenever we're attending an opportunity like this, these surveys help justify continuation of, our municipalities offering services such as these great workshops. Well, not necessarily mine is a great one, but overall, the lineup that our municipalities offer us, I think, is just a wonderful learning opportunity.
Yes, and somebody did just email me and let me know the chat box was turned off. I just changed the settings, so if you have a question and you're still
Oh
on,
my.
go ahead and try typing it now.
Yeah, we can definitely linger a few more minutes.
Yes, we're still around.
I didn't do that on purpose, you guys.
Not getting anything.
I will also add a lot of our local.
Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. We've got some questions.
Okay.
Okay. Well, first they said, thank you. Great presentation. And somebody says my succulents always grow leggy. What would be the reason?
I think my first suspicion is that they are not receiving strong enough light. They're etiolated.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe your succulents in too much shade or something like that. And then somebody asked if they can grow a Joshua tree here in Phoenix.
Okay, there have been some spectacular Joshua trees in the valley that have been growing here for decades. I find that with our increasingly extreme summers, I personally, for right here in the valley, would not recommend planting a new one. I think that every new one I've observed going in has just struggled to get established and not made it. I have seen even huge mature specimens declining because of our extreme conditions these last, 5 years or so. So that's not one I would really recommend. For up in, maybe Carefree or Queen Creek, I'd say that would be a little bit different. But right here in the valley, I wouldn't recommend it. Unfortunately. And I think, it was a little over a year ago, I was up in Fountain Hills. And some of those big, huge mature specimens in residential landscapes I saw were really suffering even up there.
Okay, well, hopefully that answers your question. Does agave?
Yeah, I know it's probably not what you wanted to hear.
Yeah. Okay, now the questions are letting in, so good. Does agave weevil only attack agave or all succulents?
No, the agave weevil will do its evil not only on agaves, but also on yuccas. Only once, but once I did actually find them in our red yucca, that very common Hesperallo that we see planted in a lot of areas, even on street medians and things. That was just once, but they definitely can attack yuccas. Overall, they will seek the agaves when they're about to bolt, about to start sending up their bloom stem, because that's when the sugars are really concentrated in the center of the plant. And they seem to prefer the bigger sized agaves, the agave americana, the Weberi. Those, larger specimens seem to be more of a draw to them than the smaller sized specimens, but they could go for any of them.
Okay, good to know. Next question. When is the best time or season to plant cacti, agave, aloe in the ground?
Fall or spring. Really, if it's something, perhaps the smooth-leafed agave that's so, freeze, frost tender, I would say that would be better planted in the spring. But most of our plants, just overall in general, are really at an advantage when we plant them in the fall, because their roots will start to develop, extend into the soil and get established because the soil's still warm. And then they've got a nice root developing already, can be strong, ready to go by the time the heat of next summer sets in. When we plant in the spring, especially if it's, late spring, April or so, we might have hit 100 degrees the next week, and they don't have as good of an opportunity to really start that root development. But just be aware. I did touch lightly on the watering. Overall, you want to keep soil on the drier side during the winter around any of your succulents. They will be quite prone to rotting if we have a hard freeze and they're in really wet soil. So for our leafy plants, it's recommended that we kind of pump them up with a good watering, if possible a day or two before a hard freeze is expected. Just the opposite with our succulents, we want to keep that soil drier during the winter.
So fall or spring. Okay, the next one, could you describe the best way to propagate Moroccan mounds? I allow them to callus for several days, but they are difficult to root. Do you have any suggestions on how to propagate them?
Totally honest, I have never tried to root those stems. Some stems of our, some stems of succulents are a little trickier. Others, they'll develop roots during the warm season within a week. That one I have never tried. You might want to try a mild rooting hormone if you're having trouble. But yeah, make sure that the stem where you cut, make sure it's well calloused. If you tap it with your fingernail, you can hear that tap. But that's the only thing I can suggest. To be honest, that's one succulent I've never tried to root a cutting of.
Okay. And then someone is asking, are the zone classifications only meant for cold hardiness, and is it important?
When we use the USDA hardiness rating, that is just for the cold temperatures. Pardon me. If you're using Sunset, their zones, it's totally different. It's a combination of your, your heat and your cold and whatnot. So that's a totally different system. Most commonly used, nationally would be that USDA cold hardiness zone system.
And then the last question we have in the chat box, what are the brown spots on the Mexican fence posts?
A lot of times those are caused by an insect, a piercing and sucking insect, probably the cactus bug. That's its actual name. That's an insect. It will pierce into the tissue and draw, resources, the fluids and nutrients from that cactus tissue. And then a lot of times that will cause that kind of a calloused spot, brown spot on the surface.
Okay, and then we had one more question just come in. To create an agave flower show, do all agaves have to come from the same parent?
Oh, that example I showed, yes. Yeah. And a lot of times, if I were to go buy an octopus agave, or 12 octopus agave at a nursery, all those agaves in that plot most likely they're from the same parent. So they will grow, develop, and mature at the same time, most likely. But yes, to get that spectacular show, they would all need to come from the same parent. That would ensure you that they're going to bloom at the same time.
Very cool.
And
That's a good question.
The smooth-leaved agave is another one that develops those bulbils. So you propagate it with those, clones, and so you could get those to, put their show on at the same time also.
All right. Well, with that, I think we've answered everybody's questions. Thanks for your patience and thanks for letting us know about the chat box. Sorry about that. But again, thank you for joining us and thank you, Kirti, for a great presentation.
One more thing, with the USDA hardiness zones, I think I forgot to answer. I think they said, is that important?
Yes.
First moved to the valley, the first 10, 15 years I lived here. Why are we worried about cold temperatures? People would come up to the Desert Botanical Garden for the plant sale from Tucson and ask, how hardy is this? It's like, we're in the desert, who cares? But after, surviving some of these cold events, these freeze events in the valley, I definitely consider knowing that cold hardiness of a plant important. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.